Hey guys, tonight we are standing in the knee-deep, freezing sludge of a French trench in 1918, where the air tastes like wet wool, rusted iron, and the kind of desperation that only comes when you haven't seen a dry pair of socks in 3 weeks. You trudge through the muck, your boots making a sound like a giant swallowing a spoonful of pudding, and you realize that the sky above you isn't just gray. No la mot mau chi nang ne. Duong hu chuk cho jo sup shuong bat ku luk now. Personally, I've always found it a bit ironic that we call this the Great War, because as you lean against a damp timber wall, there is absolutely nothing great about the smell of old corned beef and damp earth. You're clutching a heavy, primitive telephone handset, and you realize that if you breathe too loud, the person on the other end might think you're a ghost. And in this place, you probably won't survive the night without a healthy dose of luck and a very specific kind of silence. Personally, I suspect that the only reason humans haven't evolved to breathe underwater is that we spent so much time evolving to survive in these flooded ditches instead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're tucked in under a warm duvet, or maybe sitting in your car waiting for a long shift to end, I'd love to know where you are. Tell me your city and the local time in the comments. It helps remind me that even though we're exploring the lonely corners of the past, we're doing it together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the vibration of a distant artillery shell through the soles of your feet. It's not a loud bang, but a low, stomach-churning thud that reminds you gravity is still working, even if everything else is falling apart. You are part of the 142nd Infantry, 36th Division, and right now, your biggest enemy isn't the machine gun. It's the wire. It's a mainstream historical fact that World War I was a war of communication as much as it was a war of attrition, with thousands of miles of telephone wire snaking across the battlefield like a copper nervous system. The problem, as you stare at the tangled mess of black lines draped over the trench wall, is that this nervous system is currently being hacked. Every time you pick up that phone to order a sandwich or, more likely, a barrage of shells, a German listener with a set of headphones and a working knowledge of English is jotting down your every word. I find it relatable that even in 1918, we were struggling with the prehistoric version of cybersecurity. You're trying to coordinate a movement of troops, but you have to speak in a code so clunky, it sounds like you're reciting a bad grocery list. The bird flies at midnight to the bakery might mean move the tanks to the ridge. But the Germans aren't idiots. They've got the same code books, or they've just lived in the same neighborhood of linguistic logic for too long. Personally, I'd probably be so nervous about messing up the code that I'd accidentally order 5,000 pounds of onions instead of ammunition. A quirky tidbit of the Western Front is that some American units tried to use slang or even heavy Boston accents to confuse the enemy. But the German intelligence officers were often Oxford-educated and spoke English better than the guys from Southie. It's a scholarly debate whether the American reliance on these flimsy telephone lines actually prolonged the war by several months, as every offensive plan was basically leaked to the enemy the moment it was whispered into a receiver. You shift your weight, and a cold trickle of water finds its way down the back of your neck. It's a dry, biting cold that smells like damp limestone. You look over at a group of men sitting on a crate, speaking a language that sounds like wind rushing through tall grass. A rhythmic, tonal flow of sounds that has no business being here. 4,000 miles from the rolling hills of Oklahoma. These are the Choctaw. To you, an outsider, the language is a mystery, but to them, it's home. I've always felt that there's a specific kind of magic in hearing a language that wasn't designed for war being used to survive one. It's relatable, in a strange way, how we take the things we love, our words, our songs, our heritage, and turn them into a shield when the world gets too loud. Historians still argue whether the initial use of Choctaw was a desperate last resort or a calculated stroke of genius by a captain who had run out of options. But as you watch these men, you realize that for them, this isn't a strategy. It's just who they are. They are the survivors of a different kind of war, a cultural one, and they are standing here in the mud of France, ready to do what no one else can. Personally, I suspect that the universe has a very weird sense of humor, placing the most unbreakable secret in the world inside the mouths of people the government had been trying to civilize for a century. It's a paradox that makes the cold air feel a little bit more alive. You watch as a young private, a man named Solomon Lewis, picks up a headset. He doesn't look like a code talker from a movie. He looks like a tired guy who just wants a cup of coffee. But when he starts to speak, the atmosphere in the trench changes. The frantic, panicky energy of the English-speaking officers seems to bounce off him. He is calm. He is precise. He is speaking a language that the Kaiser's finest linguists couldn't decode if they had 1,000 years and a magic lamp. I find it relatable that the most powerful thing in this entire landscape of iron and fire is a series of quiet, unbreakable signals. You realize that the boring USA has a hidden depth, a layer of history that doesn't make it into the glossy textbooks, but lives in the vibration of a wire in a muddy ditch. The rain starts to pick up again, a soft patter-patter against your helmet. It's a sound that reminds you of a ticking clock. You know that tomorrow there will be a push toward a town called Saint Etienne. You know that lives depend on the words traveling through these wires. Personally, I'd be checking the connections every 5 minutes, but you see the Choctaw men just waiting, their faces illuminated by the occasional flare in the distance. They have a stoic grace that makes the chaos of the war feel small. It's a reminder that even when the world is screaming, there is a way to speak in a whisper that only your friends can hear. You lean back, trying to find a spot on the timber that isn't completely soaked. The boring USA is finally settling into its night, but here, the night is just beginning. You're part of a secret that hasn't even been named yet. You aren't just a soldier, you're a witness to the birth of a legend. You close your eyes for a second, the sound of the Choctaw language lulling you into a strange, uneasy peace. It's a long way to Oklahoma, but for a moment, the mud of France feels a little less lonely. The night in the trenches doesn't just get dark. It becomes a thick, velvety weight that feels like it's trying to press you into the mud. You're sitting there, your fingers tracing the rubber coating of a telephone wire that feels more like a cold snake than a piece of technology. Personally, I've always found it incredibly frustrating how we take the internet for granted today. Because out here, your high-speed connection is a literal piece of copper that a stray piece of shrapnel can sever in a heartbeat. You realize that the entire American offensive is essentially hanging by a thread. And that thread is being listened to by a guy named Hans 30 yards away, who probably has a better grasp of English grammar than your commanding officer. It's a mainstream historical fact that by 1918, the Germans had perfected the art of induction tapping, a sneaky bit of physics where they didn't even need to touch your wires to hear your secrets. They just had to get their own sensors close enough to the magnetic field. I think the most relatable thing about this situation is the feeling of being watched, or, in this case, overheard at all times. It's that skin-crawling sensation you get when you realize your phone might be tracking your cookies. But instead of targeted ads for lawnmowers, you're getting targeted artillery strikes. A quirky tidbit of the Western Front is that the Americans were so paranoid about German eavesdropping that they actually tried to develop scrambling devices that looked like giant steam-powered accordions. But they were so heavy, they just sank into the mud and stayed there. Personally, I suspect those accordions are still buried under a French turnip field somewhere, waiting to confuse a future archaeologist. It's a scholarly debate whether the American 36th Division would have been completely wiped out at the Meuse-Argonne if they hadn't stumbled upon a solution that had nothing to do with machines and everything to do with heritage. You watch an officer, Captain Lawrence, pacing back and forth in the narrow dugout. He's looking at a map that's so wrinkled it looks like a topographical model of a walnut. He looks like a man who has tried every password in the book and still can't get into his own account. The problem is simple. Every time he gives an order for a troop movement, the Germans are already there, waiting with their machine guns warmed up. I've always felt that the most terrifying part of war isn't the noise, but the realization that the enemy knows your thoughts before you've finished thinking them. It's a psychological grind that makes the damp air feel even heavier. Personally, I'd probably be looking for a white flag, or at least a very deep hole to hide in, but the captain is looking at two men sitting in the corner, calmly eating their rations of hardtack. These two men are Solomon Louis and Mitchell Bob. They're speaking Choctaw again, that rhythmic, rolling cadence that sounds like a river flowing over smooth stones. To the captain, it's just noise, but then a spark of desperation-fueled genius hits him. I find it relatable that the biggest breakthroughs usually happen when you're 5 minutes away from a total breakdown. He approaches them, his shadow flickering against the dirt walls in the amber light of a single tallow candle. He asks them a question that will change everything. How many of you are there who speak like that? Personally, I love the idea that the unbreakable code was sitting right there in the cafeteria, or the trench equivalent of one all along. It's an authentic moment of realization. The captain realizes that the Germans can listen to the wire all they want, but they'll never understand a language that isn't even written down in a dictionary. I've always thought that there's a specific irony in the fact that the American government spent years trying to suppress indigenous languages in boarding schools, only to realize those same languages were the only thing that could save the American army in France. It's a bit of cosmic justice that I find deeply satisfying. Even if the circumstances are grim, you watch as Solomon and Mitchell exchange a look, one of those "are they finally catching on?" eyebrow twitches that veteran co-workers use when the boss finally has a good idea. Historians still argue whether this was a formal military strategy or just a localized experiment that got lucky. But as you watch the captain pull out a notebook, you realize you're witnessing the moment the Choctaw Code Talkers were born. They weren't called that yet, of course. They were just 18 guys from the Oklahoma National Guard who happened to have a secret the Kaiser couldn't buy. You feel a shift in the energy of the dugout. The panicky, everything is broken vibe starts to give way to a quiet, focused intensity. It's the same feeling you get when you finally find the one person in the office who knows how to fix the printer. You look at the telephone receiver. It's a cold, heavy hunk of metal and vulcanized rubber. Earlier today, it felt like a liability, a direct line to the enemy's ears. Now, it feels like a weapon. Personally, I find it fascinating how a change in perspective can turn a weakness into a strength. The copper wires are still there. The German sensors are still humming in the dark, but the message has changed. You realize that the boring USA isn't just about factories and farmers. It's about a depth of culture that can bridge the gap between an Oklahoma prairie and a French forest. You trudge back out into the main trench, the mud grabbing at your heels like a needy child. You pass a group of soldiers who are checking their bayonets, their faces pale in the moonlight. They don't know about the captain's plan yet. They just know that the Germans seem to be one step ahead. But you know something they don't. You've heard the secret signals. You've seen the way Solomon Louis holds that telephone handset, not with fear, but with a quiet sense of ownership. Personally, I'd be feeling a little bit smug right now, though in a trench. Smug is usually just a prelude to getting splashed by a passing rat. The wind picks up, whistling through the gaps in the sandbags. It's a lonely, haunting sound that reminds you how far you are from anything resembling home. But then, from a few yards away, you hear a low laugh and a few words of Choctaw. It's a warm, human sound that cuts through the industrial gloom of the war. You realize that as long as these men are talking, the Germans are deaf. It's a simple, elegant solution to a chaotic, ugly problem. You settle into your spot, pulling your collar up against the rain, and for the first time in days, you don't feel like the world is listening in on your nightmares. The connection is broken, but the conversation is just beginning. The realization that your own mother tongue could be a weapon of war is a heavy thing to sit with as you watch the rain turn the trench floor into a soup of gray silt. You're watching Captain Lawrence pull a few more men aside, including a young corporal named Solomon Louis, and the look on their faces is one of quiet, amused bewilderment. Personally, I've always found it hilarious how the experts in charge usually ignore the most obvious solution until they're staring down the barrel of a total disaster. It's a mainstream historical fact that the American Expeditionary Forces were suffering from a communication blackout, so severe that messengers were being sent on foot across no man's land, because the telephone lines were basically a public broadcast for the German High Command. You watch as the captain explains his language solution, and you realize that this isn't just about winning a battle. It's about a linguistic pivot that shouldn't work. Yet, somehow, it's the only thing that does. I think the most relatable thing about this moment is that feeling of finally being seen for a skill you were told was useless. Imagine being these Choctaw men who had been punished in school for speaking their native language, only to have a frantic American captain beg them to speak it as fast as they can. A quirky tidbit of this linguistic experiment is that the Choctaw language didn't actually have words for modern military hardware, because, fun fact, the Choctaw Nation hadn't spent the last century designing tanks and mustard gas. Personally, I suspect that trying to translate machine gun into a language built for hunting and farming led to some pretty creative mental gymnastics. It's a scholarly debate whether the spontaneous nature of the code was more effective than the later, more rigid codes of WWT words, because in 1918, it was pure, unadulterated instinct. You watch as they test the line for the first time. Two Choctaw soldiers are placed at opposite ends of a field telephone, one in the front line dugout and one back at headquarters. The air in the dugout is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. Personally, I'd be sweating through my wool tunic if I knew the entire 142nd Infantry was riding on my ability to describe a battalion in a language that prefers the word group of warriors. But as Solomon begins to speak, you see the tension leave his shoulders. He isn't reciting a code book. He's just talking to a friend. I've always felt that the most unbreakable secrets aren't the ones behind iron doors, but the ones hidden in plain sight, protected by a culture that the enemy doesn't even know exists. There's an authentic, gritty beauty in the way the words flow over the wire. To the German eavesdroppers, who are currently hunched over their induction sensors with their expensive dictionaries, this must sound like an alien invasion. Personally, I love the idea of some highly decorated German professor of linguistics slowly losing his mind, trying to figure out if this is a new American dialect or if the heat has finally made the Yanks go crazy. It's a relatable bit of sticking it to the man, except the man, in this case, is the entire German Empire. You realize that the boring USA isn't just a collection of factories. It's a living, breathing mosaic of cultures that, when pushed into a corner, can conjure a miracle out of thin air. Historians still argue whether the Choctaw were recruited for this task or if they simply stepped up because they saw their officers failing. But as you watch the captain's face brighten, you know that the language solution is no longer an experiment. It's the new standard. You feel a strange sense of pride, even as you shiver in the damp cold. It's that feeling you get when the underdog finally scores, or when the uncomplicated guy in the office solves the problem the CEO couldn't touch. You look at the telephone wire again. It's still the same copper thread. But now it carries something the Germans can't touch: the soul of a nation they never bothered to study. I've always thought that the best stories are the ones where the thing that was meant to be forgotten becomes the thing that saves everyone. You watch the men refine their terms. Since they don't have a word for artillery, they decide to call it big gun. A machine gun becomes little gun shoot fast. Personally, I find this simplicity deeply refreshing. In a war that was obsessed with complicated acronyms and rigid hierarchies, the Choctaw brought a directness that was impossible to intercept. It's relatable, isn't it? When everything gets too complicated, we usually find the answer in the most basic, honest parts of ourselves. You trudge back to your post, the mud making a schlop sound with every step. You pass a group of weary doughboys who are waiting for orders that usually come too late or get intercepted. You want to tell them that the world has changed, but you keep your mouth shut. This is a secret that needs to stay in the wires. I suspect that the roughneck attitude we talked about earlier, that stoic, do your job and don't complain vibe, is exactly what makes these men perfect for this. They don't need the glory, they just need the line to stay open. The wind howls over the parapet, bringing with it the scent of charred wood from a nearby village. It's a lonely sound, but as you pass the communication dugout, you hear the low, rhythmic hum of Choctaw again. It's a signal in the dark. You realize that for the first time in weeks, the Americans aren't just reacting, they're planning. And they're doing it in a language that was here long before the USA even had a name. It's a bit of ancient history being used to build the modern world, a paradox that I find incredibly poetic, even if it's wrapped in mud and mustard gas. You settle into your watch, your eyes scanning the dark, jagged landscape of no man's land. The boring USA might be a world of farms and factories, but tonight, it's a world of whispers. You realize that the language solution wasn't just a clever trick. It was a reclamation. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic cadence of the Choctaw signal still echoing in your mind. It's a soft background hum that makes the nightmare of the war feel just a little bit more like a story that might actually have a happy ending. Or at least, an ending where you get to go home. The transition from a desperate dugout brainstorm to an actual field operation is always a messy, clunky affair. And you're right in the middle of it as the 142nd Infantry prepares for a night maneuver. Captain Lawrence is gambling his career, and quite a few lives, on this experimental deployment of native speech. Personally, I've always found it a bit stressful how the military operates on trial by fire. It's like being the first person to try a new parachute. You really hope the guy who folded it wasn't having an off day. It's a mainstream historical fact that in October 1918, the American command officially authorized the use of Choctaw soldiers to transmit orders over telephone and radio during the tactical movements leading up to the Saint Etienne offensive. You watch the telephone squad get into position, their heavy packs and wire spools making them look like industrial ants, and you realize that if this doesn't work, the captain is going to be explaining a very expensive failure to a very angry general. I think the most relatable thing about this gamble is the sheer, unadulterated nerves of everyone involved. You see the officers glancing at their watches every 30 seconds, their faces illuminated by the green glow of phosphorus on the dials. Personally, I'd be the one triple-checking the signal strength and then panicking that I forgot how to say hello. A quirky tidbit of this first deployment is that the Choctaw soldiers were actually quite amused by the frantic energy of the white officers. While the colonels were sweating through their starch, the Choctaw men were reportedly as calm as if they were back home in Oklahoma, probably wondering why everyone was making such a big deal out of just talking. I've always felt that the best way to handle a high-stress situation is to pretend you're just doing something mundane, like checking your mail or, in this case, directing a multi-battalion offensive in a language the enemy thinks is a code from Mars. You trudge along the edge of a communication trench, your fingers grazing the rough, splintered wood of the revetments. The gamble is taking place in real time. You hear the faint click-clack of the field phones being hooked up. This is the moment where the experimental becomes the reality. Personally, I suspect that the Germans were already sitting in their listening posts, adjusting their headsets, and getting their fountain pens ready to record the usual American troop movements. Little did they know, they were about to be hit by a linguistic tidal wave that no amount of Prussian military training could prepare them for. It's a scholarly debate whether the Choctaw Gamble was more influential in the success of the 36th Division than the actual weaponry used, because a gun you can't coordinate is just a very heavy paperweight. There's an authentic raw tension in the air as the first orders go out. You pass a dugout where a soldier is speaking into a mouthpiece, his voice a low, steady murmur of glottal stops and tonal shifts. He's telling a unit to move to a specific map coordinate, but he's doing it in Choctaw. I find it relatable how we often find the most strength in the things that make us different. For decades, these men were told their language was a barrier to success. Tonight, it's the only path to it. Personally, I love a good underdog story where the flaw becomes the superpower. It makes the freezing mud and the smell of ozone from the batteries feel a bit more like the setting of an epic than a tragedy. Historians still argue whether the Germans ever truly realized what was happening, or if they just assumed the Americans had developed a sophisticated machine to scramble their voices. But as you watch the captain's face as he receives a confirmed signal from the forward units, you know the gamble is paying off. The orders are getting through. The troops are moving in total silence. No German artillery is raining down on their positions because the German listeners are currently staring at each other in total confusion. It's that feeling of triumph when you finally bypass a complicated security system with a simple analog trick. You realize the boring USA isn't just about the loud industrial might of the tanks. It's about the quiet, cultural might of the men driving them. You see a group of runners, the guys whose job it was to sprint through fire when the phones failed, leaning against a sandbag, looking confused. They're out of a job tonight because the phones aren't failing. The experimental phase has proven that as long as you have a Choctaw speaker on both ends, you have a direct, unhackable line to victory. Personally, I'd be feeling pretty relieved if I were a runner. Although I'd probably also be wondering if I'm about to be replaced by a linguistic software update. It's relatable, isn't it? The way technology, or in this case, a rediscovered human skill, instantly changes the job market. The night air is biting, smelling of damp wool and old wood smoke. You look at the sky, which is a bruised, dark purple, and you think about the families of these men back in Oklahoma. They have no idea that their language is currently saving lives on a different continent. I've always felt that the most significant moments in history are often the ones that happen in the shadows, without cameras or press releases. You're watching 18 men become the architects of a new kind of warfare, all because a captain decided to bet it all on a language that wasn't American enough for the schools, but was perfectly American for the trenches. You settle into a small corner of the trench, trying to keep your boots out of the deepest puddles. The boring USA might be a world of rules and regulations, but tonight, the only rule is that it works. You hear the rhythmic cadence of the Choctaw signals echoing faintly from a nearby communication post. It's a soft background hum that makes the nightmare of the front line feel just a little bit more like a choreographed dance than a chaotic brawl. You realize that the gamble wasn't just about the orders, it was about the men. Personally, I find a lot of comfort in the idea that when everything else fails, the wires, the codes, the machines, we still have our voices. You close your eyes, the sound of the Choctaw language lulling you into a strange, rhythmic peace. It's a long way to Saint Etienne, but the unbreakable signals are already clearing the way. You realize that the boring USA project is a beautiful, improvisational beast. And tonight, it's speaking a language that the rest of the world has yet to learn. The signal repeats, a low, tonal murmur that carries the weight of 1,000 years into a war that is barely 4 years old. It's a connection that can't be cut by a bayonet or intercepted by an antenna. You take a deep breath, the cold air stinging your lungs, and you wait for the dawn. The gamble is won, the orders are set, and the unbreakable signals are the only thing standing between you and the abyss. Sweet dreams, for now, while the signals keep watch. The damp air of the communication dugout feels even thicker tonight, saturated with the smell of wet ink and the sharp, acidic tang of a lead pencil as you watch a group of Choctaw soldiers huddled around a small, portable table. They are performing a task that feels like a cross between a high-stakes puzzle and a poetry slam. They are creating the Dictionary of Deception. Personally, I've always found it fascinating how language is a living, breathing thing that has to stretch and bend to accommodate new, often horrific realities. In 1918, these men were looking at a battlefield that had outpaced their vocabulary. It's a mainstream historical fact that because the Choctaw language lacked specific words for battalion, machine gun, or poison gas, the 19 code talkers had to create a standardized military vocabulary by repurposing traditional Choctaw terms. You watch as they debate, their voices low and rhythmic, and you realize that you're witnessing the birth of a linguistic shadow world, a dictionary where nothing is quite what it seems. I think the most relatable thing about this vocabulary hack is the way we all use shorthand to describe things we don't fully understand. It's like when you call the weird plastic piece on the back of your TV the doohickey or the thingamajig. Except here, if you get the thingamajig wrong, a battery of Big Bertha guns might level the wrong hill. A quirky tidbit of this creative process is that artillery became virihito, or big gun, while machine gun was cleverly translated as little gun shoot fast. Personally, I suspect that poison gas being translated as bad air was probably the most accurate description ever uttered in a trench. I've always felt that there is a profound, rustic elegance in this simplicity. It's a reminder that when the world gets too complicated with its technological jargon, the most effective tool is a direct, honest image. You lean against the earthen wall, feeling the cool moisture seep through your uniform as you listen to them work. A battalion became one tribe, and regiment became 3 tribes. I find it deeply poetic that in the middle of a conflict that was trying to strip away individual identity and turn men into numbers, the Choctaw were reinserting the concept of the tribe into the very structure of the army. It's an authentic, grounded rebellion against the industrialization of the human soul. Personally, I love the irony that the American military, which had spent decades trying to dismantle the tribal system back home, was now utterly dependent on it for tactical survival. It's a scholarly debate whether this improvised dictionary was actually more secure than a pre-written code, because it relied on cultural context that no German academic, no matter how many books they had on Americana, could ever truly simulate. You see a corporal named Otis Leader scribbling a few notes. He looks up and catches your eye, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. I find it relatable how a shared secret can make even the most miserable environment feel a bit like an exclusive club. They are building a world where a scout is a crow and a tank is a turtle. I suspect that the turtle was a particularly favorite term. There's something hilariously accurate about a slow-moving, armored beast crawling through the mud. It's a bit of roughneck humor that cuts through the grim reality of the Western Front. I've always felt that the best way to handle something terrifying is to give it a name that makes it feel a little more manageable, a little more human. The Dictionary of Deception was more than just a list of words. It was a psychological fortress. You realize that the Germans, even if they recognized the language, were looking for literal translations. They were listening for infantry or coordinates, but all they heard were stories about turtles, crows, and tribes. Personally, I'd be losing my mind if I were a German cryptographer, convinced that the Americans had finally abandoned all logic and started talking about a high-altitude zoo. It's that feeling of being completely out of the loop, like when your kids use slang that makes you feel like you're 1,000 years old. Except in this case, the stakes are the Meuse-Argonne offensive. You trudge out of the dugout, your boots sinking into the familiar clinging mire. The sun is a pale, weak disk through the smoke of the horizon, looking more like a bruised thumbprint than a star. You pass a supply sergeant who is grumbling about logistics. I find it relatable how we get obsessed with the physical stuff, the crates, the shells, the trucks, while ignoring the fact that the most important supply of all is a clear, unhackable idea. The Choctaw didn't need a supply train for their dictionary. They carried it in their heads. It was the only weapon on the battlefield that didn't need a cleaning kit or a refill. I've always thought that the most powerful thing you can do to an enemy is to make them feel stupid. The Dictionary of Deception did exactly that. It turned the German intelligence machine into a library of useless books. You shiver as a cold wind whistles through the wire, sounding like a low flute. It's a lonely sound, but as you pass a communication post, you hear a soldier say 3 tribes into a handset. It's a signal that means more than just a number. It means a connection, a heritage, and a way home. Personally, I find a lot of comfort in the thought that even in a world of big guns and bad air, a tribe can still find its way through the dark. You find a relatively dry spot on a crate and settle in, the Dictionary of Deception echoing in your mind. The boring USA is finally settling into its night, but here, the The language is just starting to do its work. You realize that you're witnessing a masterclass in adaptation. You close your eyes for a second, the image of the turtle tank and the crow scout lulling you into a strange, uneasy sleep. It's a long way to Oklahoma, but the words are already building the bridge. You take a final breath of the metallic air, feeling the weight of the secret, and you wait for the next signal. The dictionary is open, the terms are set, and the boring USA is finally speaking in a way that the world will never forget. The transition from a quiet dugout brainstorm to the deafening reality of a full-scale assault is a sensory shock that no amount of training can truly prepare you for. You're standing on the edge of the Saint Etienne offensive, and the morning air doesn't just feel cold. No kokam giach nhumot loi dao kao reset jang quet qua la poi qua ban. Personally, I've always found it a bit absurd that humans decided the best way to resolve a disagreement was to throw millions of tons of steel at each other in a muddy field. But as you watch the 142nd Infantry prepare to move, you realize that the unbreakable signals are about to be tested in the ultimate laboratory of fire. It's a mainstream historical fact that the battle for Saint Etienne à Arnay in October 1918 was one of the most successful applications of the Choctaw Code, where a series of coordinated strikes were executed with a speed that left the German High Command in a state of paralyzed disbelief. You watch as the Choctaw soldiers take their places at the field phones, their faces calm while the rest of the world is screaming, and you realize that you're witnessing the first real-world proof of a linguistic miracle. I think the most relatable thing about this success is the feeling of a plan finally coming together after weeks of absolute chaos. It's like when you're working on a project that's been a total train wreck, and then one person suggests a tiny change that suddenly makes everything click. A quirky tidbit of the Saint Etienne fight is that the Germans were so convinced their lines were secure that when the American artillery began falling with surgical precision on their hidden machine gun nests, they actually checked their own maps for traitors within their ranks. Personally, I suspect they spent more time looking for a spy in a German uniform than they did looking for the Choctaw speakers in the American one. I've always felt that there is a specific kind of justice in being so brilliant that your enemy assumes you must be cheating. It's a scholarly debate whether the Saint Etienne offensive would have even been possible without the telephone squad, as previous attempts to take the ridge had failed primarily due to intercepted communications and leaked orders. You trudge through the debris of a shattered village, the smell of brick dust and spent gunpowder thick enough to chew. The sound of the little guns shooting fast is a constant rhythmic backdrop to the big guns of the artillery. Personally, I'd be crawling into the nearest cellar and staying there until the 1950s. But you see the Choctaw men moving with a steady, unhurried focus. They are transmitting coordinates for the 2nd Division's advance. And for the first time in the war, the Germans aren't moving their reserves to meet the threat. Why? Because they don't know the threat is coming. The orders are traveling through the copper wires in a language that Hans and Fritz can't find in their military handbooks. I find it relatable how we often focus on the loud weapons, the tanks and the shells, while the most effective weapon is actually a quiet, clear voice. There's an authentic, gritty pride in the way the officers are looking at the Choctaw soldiers now. Yesterday, they were a curiosity. Today, they are the lifeline. You see Captain Lawrence leaning over a table, a broad, relieved smile on his face, as he receives a report that the first objective has been taken with minimal casualties. I find it relatable how success suddenly makes everyone a believer. Personally, I love the idea that the boring USA was winning the war not just with industrial output, but with a linguistic heritage that the rest of the world had tried to erase. It's a bit of cosmic irony that I find deeply satisfying. The very thing that was labeled backward in the schools of Oklahoma was now the most advanced technology on the battlefield. Historians still argue whether the Saint Etienne success was the turning point for the 36th Division, but for the men on the ground, the evidence is in the lack of German shells hitting their assembly points. You realize that the dictionary of deception worked perfectly. The turtles moved, the crows scouted, and the tribes converged, and the German eavesdroppers heard nothing but a story they couldn't understand. Personally, I'd be feeling a bit like a magician who just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. Except the rabbit is a successful infantry advance on a heavily fortified position. It's that feeling of outsmarting a system that was designed to crush you. The afternoon sun is a pale, smoky orange, casting long, spindly shadows across the craters. You pass a group of German prisoners being led to the rear, and they look genuinely bewildered. I've always thought that the most powerful thing about the Choctaw Code wasn't that it couldn't be broken, but that it didn't even sound like a code. To the Germans, it sounded like gibberish, like the Americans had finally cracked under the strain and started speaking in tongues. I find it relatable that sometimes the best way to hide something is to be so honest and direct that people assume you're being deceptive. It's the boring USA at its most brilliantly transparent. You find a moment to sit against a rusted tank, the metal still warm from the engine. You look at your hands, which are stained with the gray mud of France, and you listen. For a second, between the crashes of the shells, you hear it. The tonal, rhythmic murmur of a Choctaw soldier at a nearby field phone. It's a sound that has survived the Meuse Argonne, and it's a sound that is winning. Personally, I find a lot of comfort in that. It's a reminder that even in the middle of an industrial nightmare, the human voice is still the most powerful frequency. You realize that the unbreakable signals have passed their test. I think the most important part of the Saint Etienne success was the psychological shift. The American troops started to walk with a little more swagger, knowing that their secret was holding. It's relatable, isn't it? When you know you have an edge, you perform better. The Choctaw soldiers aren't just talkers anymore. They are the heart of the division's intelligence. You shiver as the wind picks up, carrying the scent of winter. But the unbreakable signals feel like a warm fire in a cold world. You realize that the boring USA is finally finding its rhythm. And it's a rhythm that the Kaiser can't stop. You settle back, the sound of the Choctaw signals echoing in your mind like a soft background hum. The boring USA is finally finding its voice, and it's a voice that carries the weight of 1,000 years into the heart of the modern world. You close your eyes for a second, the image of the unbreakable signals lulling you into a strange, triumphant peace. It's a long way home, but the bridge is being built, one word at a time. The success at Saint Etienne is just the beginning. The world is finally listening, even if it doesn't understand a single word. The fog of war has a way of turning everything into a ghost story. But as you move through the staging area behind the lines, you realize that the telephone squad is the most solid thing in this shifting landscape. You're watching 18 men, the original elite, working with a precision that makes a Swiss watch look like a pile of rusted gears. Personally, I've always found it fascinating how a small group of specialists can become the backbone of an entire army. Like that one IT guy in every office who actually knows why the server keeps crashing. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Choctaw Telephone Squad consisted of 18 men recruited from the 141st and 142nd Infantry Regiments, specifically chosen for their fluency in their native tongue and their ability to handle the high-pressure environment of the Signal Corps. You watch them checking their equipment, their hands moving with the easy grace of men who know their worth, and you realize that you're looking at the prototype for every special ops unit that would follow in the next century. I think the most relatable thing about this specialist life is the way these men have become a unit within a unit. They have their own jokes, their own rhythm, and a shared secret that separates them from the thousands of other doughboys in the 36th Division. A quirky tidbit of the telephone squad is that despite their critical role, they were often still carrying the standard issue 30-pound Type 19117 field telephones, which were basically the size of a microwave and about as ergonomic as a cinder block. Personally, I suspect that half of their specialized training was just learning how to carry that heavy hunk of metal through a trench without tripping over a rat and knocking themselves unconscious. I've always felt that the most impressive parts of history aren't the high-tech gadgets, but the way human beings manage to do extraordinary things with tools that look like they belong in a junkyard. You watch Solomon Lewis and Peter Maytubby testing a line. The copper wire is draped over a shattered apple tree, its bark blackened by fire. There's an authentic, gritty beauty in the way they work. They don't need a code book. They just need each other. I find it relatable how we often spend millions on secure communication when the most secure thing in the world is just a deep, cultural connection that an outsider can't fake. Personally, I love the idea that 18 guys from Oklahoma were essentially outthinking the entire cryptanalysis department of the German Empire. It's a scholarly debate whether the telephone squad was an official military designation at the time or just a convenient nickname used by the officers, but for you, watching them in the gray light of a French morning, they are the most official thing you've ever seen. I've always thought that the best teams are the ones that don't need to talk about their mission statement because they're too busy living it. You see the respect in the eyes of the other soldiers as they pass by. These 18 men aren't just talkers, they are the bridge between a command that is often out of touch and a front line that is always under fire. Personally, I'd be feeling a bit like a VIP if I were in their boots. Though in a trench, VIP usually just means you're the first one the enemy tries to target. It's that feeling of being indispensable, like the one person in the group who actually knows how to read the map during a road trip. You realize that the boring USA has a hidden elite, a group of specialists whose power comes from the very thing society told them to hide. Historians still argue whether more tribes would have been recruited if the war had lasted into 1919, but for now, the 18 Choctaw are the sole keepers of the secret. You watch as they pack up their gear, preparing to move forward with the next wave of the offensive. I find it relatable that even when you're part of a world-changing experiment, your daily life is still about the basics. Is my gear dry? Did I get my coffee? Is the wire long enough? Personally, I find a lot of comfort in that mundane reality. It reminds us that history isn't made by gods. It's made by 18 guys with sore backs and a unique way of speaking. You trudge along behind them, the mud making that familiar schlop sound that has become the soundtrack of your life. The boring USA is finally finding its stride in France, and it's doing it with a level of sophistication that no one expected. You pass a broken derrick from a nearby quarry, its iron arm reaching toward the sky like a plea for help. I've always thought that the 1918 battlefield was a place where the 19th and 20th centuries were colliding at high speed, and the telephone squad was the only thing that made sense of the wreckage. They are the human element in an industrial storm, a bit of roughneck ingenuity that I find deeply moving. As the sun begins to fade, casting long, spindly shadows across the craters, you see the 18 men silhouetted against the horizon. They look like a single biological machine. Much like the rivet gangs we talked about earlier, they are a single unit of 18 brains, all synchronized to the same tonal frequency. Personally, I suspect that the Boilermaker's ear we discussed is nothing compared to the focused hearing these men have developed. They can hear a Choctaw whisper through a mile of static and artillery fire. It's a superpower that I find incredibly relatable. The way we tune out the noise of the world to hear the one thing that matters. You find a spot to rest, the sound of the Choctaw signals echoing in your mind like a soft, rhythmic hum. The boring USA is finally speaking. And it's speaking in a language that carries the weight of 1,000 years. You realize that you're witnessing a masterclass in specialized excellence. You close your eyes for a second, the image of the 18 specialists lulling you into a strange, uneasy peace. It's a long way home, but the unbreakable signals are the only map you need. The telephone squad is ready. The line is open, and the world is about to hear a story it won't understand for another 50 years. I think the most authentic thing about this squad is their lack of pretension. They don't see themselves as elite. They see themselves as soldiers with a job to do. But you know better. You've seen the way they turn a wire into a weapon. You take a final breath of the cold, metallic air, feeling the vibration of the distant guns, and you wait. The 18 are in position. The secret is safe. And the boring USA is finally finding its voice in the dark. As the rain settles into a persistent, icy drizzle, you find yourself sharing a cramped, timber-lined dugout with a few members of the squad. And for the first time, you find yourself looking at the men under the helmet. Personally, I've always found it a bit strange how we tend to look at historical figures as two-dimensional statues, rather than guys who probably had a favorite type of pie and a specific way they liked their boots tied. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Choctaw soldiers of WWI were not actually U.S. citizens at the time they enlisted. The Indian Citizenship Act wouldn't be passed until 1924, meaning these men were fighting for a country that officially considered them wards rather than equals. You watch a soldier named Joseph Oklahomby, who would later become one of the most decorated heroes of the war, quietly cleaning a smudge of mud off his helmet, and you realize that the complex heritage he carries is heavier than any pack. I think the most relatable thing about this identity struggle is the feeling of belonging to two worlds while being fully accepted by neither. It's like being the new kid at school, who also happens to be the only person who knows how to solve the math problem on the board. A quirky tidbit of the Choctaw experience in France is that many of the men were actually fluent in 3 languages: Choctaw, English, and a smattering of French they picked up in the villages, making them some of the most linguistically versatile soldiers on the Western Front. Personally, I suspect that they used this to their advantage to swap stories, and probably some subpar army tobacco, with the local French farmers, who were just as confused by the Americans as the Germans were. I've always felt that the most authentic part of the boring USA is this messy, beautiful collision of cultures that happens when nobody is looking at the official rulebook. You see a soldier leaning against a sandbag, his face illuminated by a flickering tallow candle that smells like old bacon grease. This is the human side of the secret weapon. They aren't just signals. They are sons of the Choctaw Nation, who grew up in the rural hills of Oklahoma. Many of them having survived the brutal boarding school system designed to kill the Indian and save the man. I find it deeply relatable how we often find our greatest strength in the very thing the world tried to take away from us. Personally, I love the quiet defiance in their eyes. They are speaking Choctaw, not just to win a war, but because it is their right, a rhythmic reclamation of their own souls in the middle of a European nightmare. It's a scholarly debate whether their patriotism was a desire to prove their worth to a skeptical U.S. government or a traditional warrior culture response to a global threat. But as you watch them, it feels more personal than political. I've always thought that a helmet is a great equalizer. It hides your hair, your ears, and half your face, turning you into a generic soldier. But when these men speak, the helmet becomes irrelevant. You realize that the boring USA is actually a collection of incredible individual stories hidden under identical wool uniforms. Personally, I'd be feeling a bit of a brain melt trying to reconcile fighting for a government that didn't even give me a vote. But these men move with a purposeful, stoic grace. They are the roughnecks of the linguistics world, doing the heavy lifting of communication without asking for a thank you note. It's that feeling of doing the right thing because it needs to be done, even if the management hasn't quite caught up to your level of humanity. Historians still argue about the internal lives of these men because they rarely left behind the kind of dramatic, self-important diaries that the officer class loved to write. I find it relatable that the most important people in history are often the ones who are too busy working to write about it. You watch a soldier take a sip of lukewarm coffee, his eyes reflecting the distant orange flashes of artillery. He looks tired, the kind of soul-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying the secret of a division while navigating the trauma of your own history. Personally, I find a lot of respect in that silence. It's a reminder that the boring USA is built on the backs of people who didn't need a spotlight to shine. You trudge out of the dugout, the air smelling of wet wool and charred turnips. You pass a group of soldiers who are complaining about the mud and the food, the usual infantry gripes that I find incredibly authentic. But the Choctaw squad is different. They have a quietness to them, a focused energy that I find deeply moving. They are the telephone squad, but under the helmets, they are the keepers of a 1,000-year-old fire. I've always felt that the 1918 battlefield was a place where the past was being used to save the future, and these men were the living proof of that paradox. As you walk, you think about the code talker legacy. We usually think of the Navajo in Guayutui, but it started here, with 18 guys in 1918. Personally, I suspect that the reason the Choctaw story was forgotten for so long is that it didn't fit the neat, tidy narrative of the American hero that Hollywood liked to sell. They were too complex, too real, and their heritage was too uncomfortable for a country still struggling with its own identity. I find it relatable how we often lose the best parts of our history because we're too busy looking at the shiny, simple stuff. You find a spot to rest against a stack of crates, the sound of the Choctaw signals echoing in your mind like a soft background hum. The boring USA is finally speaking, and it's speaking in a voice that is both ancient and brand new. You realize that you're witnessing the most authentic version of the American dream. Not the one on the posters, but the one in the trenches, where heritage and survival are the same thing. You close your eyes for a second, the image of the men under the helmet lulling you into a strange, respectful peace. It's a long way to Oklahoma, but the unbreakable signals are already there. I think the most important thing to remember is that these men weren't tools used by the army. They were soldiers who brought their own tools to the fight. You take a final breath of the cold, metallic air, feeling the vibration of the distant guns, and you wait. The 18 are in position. The secret is safe, and the boring USA is finally finding its soul in the dark. Sweet dreams, while the signals keep their vigil. The sensory landscape of a battlefield at night is a jagged, surreal nightmare that makes a horror movie look like a children's puppet show. You are moving through the ruins of a French forest, and the sound of survival isn't a heroic anthem. It's a chaotic, overlapping mess of whistling shells, the frantic thump-thump of your own heart, and the distant, rhythmic chugging of an air compressor that reminds you of the rivet gangs back in the city. Personally, I've always found it a bit insulting when people describe war as organized, because as you navigate no man's land, you realize it's just a very expensive way to turn a landscape into a garbage dump. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Meuse-Argonne offensive was the largest in United States military history, involving 1.2 million American soldiers and a level of noise that was reportedly heard as far away as the coast of England. You're trudging through this sonic wall, and the only thing that makes any sense is the quiet, tonal murmur of a Choctaw signal traveling through a wire that you're desperately trying not to trip over. I think the most relatable thing about this sensory nightmare is the way your brain starts to filter out the big, scary noises and fixates on the tiny, human ones. You don't hear the 1,000-pound shell, you hear the click of a field phone or the splash of a rat in a nearby puddle. A quirky tidbit of the 1918 experience is that many soldiers actually developed a sixth sense for the sound of incoming artillery, claiming they could tell the caliber of a gun by the whistle it made through the air. Personally, I suspect that sixth sense was just a very high level of terror-induced focus, but it's an authentic bit of boring USA survival skills. I've always felt that the most impressive thing about the human spirit is its ability to find a rhythm in the middle of a literal apocalypse. It's a scholarly debate whether the psychological trauma of the shell shock era was actually intensified by the shift from the quiet, rural sounds of the 19th century to the industrial, mechanical screaming of the 20th. You're crawling along a ridge, the smell of ozone and wet limestone making your eyes water. The air is thick with dust motes and coal smoke, a soft focus, cinematic depth that would be beautiful if it weren't trying to kill you. Personally, I'd be curled in a ball crying for my mom. But you see the Choctaw squad navigating this abyss with a level of body awareness that makes a yoga instructor look like a bumbling amateur. They are laying wire as they go, feeling the texture of the earth through their gloves. They aren't just talking, they are feeling the pressure of the air, sensing a change in the wind before it hits them. I find it deeply relatable how we develop these hyper-specific skills when our lives depend on it. It's that ironworker's gait we talked about, a heavy-set, deliberate movement that keeps your center of gravity low and wide. I've always thought that silence is the most terrifying sound in a war zone because it usually means something big is about to happen. But for the Choctaw squads, silence is their best friend. When they do speak, it's a quiet, rhythmic hum that doesn't compete with the artillery. It slides under it. Personally, I love the idea that the most effective communication on the planet was happening at a frequency the Germans couldn't even hear emotionally. It's that feeling of having a secret language with your best friend in a crowded room. Except the room is a 300-mile-long trench system, and the best friend is a guy named Mitchell Bob holding a Type 1917 handset. You realize that the boring USA project is built on these quiet, unbreakable connections that the ground dwellers will never fully grasp. Historians still argue whether the fearlessness of the native soldiers was a genuine trait or a carefully constructed social mask, much like the ironworkers on the beams. Personally, I suspect it's a bit of both. You learn to look through the height, or in this case, the fire. You don't look at the explosion, You look at the next bolt hole, the next wire fix, the next syllable. I find it relatable that even in the most extreme conditions, the human brain can normalize almost anything. You're not defying death. You're just going to work. You pass a broken derrick in the woods, its rusted arm looking like a prehistoric skeleton in the amber light of a distant flare. It's a reminder that the world of steel and science is just as fragile as the men who build it. The wind picks up, a persistent, invisible hand that swirls and eddies through the shattered trees. It carries the scent of charred wood and old, damp wool. You look at your hands, and they're steady. That's the most important thing. If your hands start to shake, you're done. I think the most authentic part of the sound of survival is the way it forces you to become a machine, a component in a linguistic circuit. When the phone hiss pops on, your body tenses. When it goes dead, you relax. I find it relatable that in our modern world, we use white noise to sleep. But for the soldier of 1918, the only way to find peace was to get so used to the noise that silence became the thing that felt wrong. You find a spot to hunker down against a stone wall that used to be a farmhouse. You look up at the sky, which is a dark, bruised navy, and you hear it, the tonal, rhythmic murmur of a Choctaw soldier at a nearby post. It's a signal in the dark, a soft background hum that makes the nightmare feel a little less lonely. Personally, I find a lot of comfort in that. It's a reminder that even when the world is screaming, there is a way to speak in a whisper that carries the weight of 1,000 years. You realize that the boring USA is finally finding its voice, and it's a voice that the abyss can't swallow. I think the most telling part of this experience is the view from the bottom. You're not on a skyscraper looking down. You're in a hole looking up. But the feeling is the same. You are a giant in a sprawling, unfinished project of survival. You are the one shaping the horizon with your words. It's a powerful, intoxicating feeling. And I suspect it's why these men kept talking, mile after mile, wire after wire. You close your eyes for a second, the image of the unbreakable signals, lulling you into a strange, rhythmic peace. It's a long way to Oklahoma, but the bridge is being built. You take a final breath of the metallic, smoky air, feeling the vibration of the distant guns in your spine. The night is far from over, but the signals are clear. The boring USA is finally finding its soul in the dark, and it's a soul that speaks a language of fire and iron. You relax your grip on the mud, let the sound of the Choctaw signals wash over you, and wait for the dawn. The abyss is just a background color now. The German confusion behind the lines is almost palpable, a thick, invisible layer of frustration that you can practically taste in the damp morning air. You are observing a captured German intelligence post, and the scene is one of absolute linguistic chaos. Personally, I've always found it a bit satisfying to watch a perfectionist system completely melt down when faced with something it didn't plan for. It's a mainstream historical fact that the German High Command was so baffled by the Choctaw Code that they actually sent a special team of linguists and ethnologists to the front lines to try and identify the new American dialect being used over the wires. You imagine these high-ranking officers with their monocles and their centuries of academic tradition hunched over their headsets, listening to a language that had been around since before the Roman Empire, and realizing they didn't have a single book that could help them. I think the most relatable thing about this German confusion is that feeling of being completely out of the loop while everyone else seems to be in on the joke. It's like when you're in a meeting and everyone is using corporate acronyms that make you feel like you're listening to a foreign language, except in this case, the acronyms are actually the soul of the Choctaw Nation. A quirky tidbit of this era is that the Germans were so desperate to break the code that they began to suspect the Americans were using a sophisticated voice-scrambling machine, a proto-computer that didn't exist yet, rather than just, people. Personally, I suspect that the German ego couldn't handle the idea that a culture they viewed as primitive was actually light years ahead of them in terms of security. I've always felt that the most effective way to beat an arrogant enemy is to be so authentic that they think you're being deceptive. You see a group of German prisoners being interrogated near a communication post, and their faces are a mixture of exhaustion and genuine bewilderment. One of them, a young sergeant with a headset still around his neck, is shaking his head as he listens to a Choctaw soldier speak into a field phone nearby. I find it deeply relatable how we often assume that because we don't understand something, it must be nonsense. To the Germans, the tonal shifts and glottal stops of Choctaw sounded like static, like the Americans had finally given up on language altogether. Personally, I love the image of a Prussian colonel throwing his headphones against a timber wall in a fit of rage because he can't figure out why two turtles are attacking his left flank. It's a scholarly debate whether the German inability to decode the Choctaw language actually led to an intelligence paralysis in the final weeks of the war, as they became so distrustful of their own ears that they stopped reacting to intercepted orders entirely. I've always thought that the boring USA is at its best when it's being a bit of a trickster. You watch as a Choctaw speaker gives a little nod to his partner, a subtle, "we got 'em" look that I find incredibly authentic. They know they're winning the mental war. Personally, I'd be tempted to start making up even weirder terms just to see how far I could push the German linguists. Maybe tell them that the flying squirrels are bringing the spicy pickles. It's that roughneck humor again, a dark, cynical wit that flourishes when you're dangling over the abyss. You realize that the most powerful thing you can do to an enemy is to make them doubt their own intelligence. It's a psychological grind that turns the industrial might of the German army into a collection of confused men in gray coats. The atmosphere in the American lines, by contrast, is one of quiet, almost smug confidence. You pass a group of doughboys who are laughing about the German ears being turned into German tin cans. I find it relatable how a shared secret creates a bond that no drill sergeant can ever enforce. The telephone squad has become a legend within the division, the ninjas of the airwaves. Personally, I suspect that the reason the 36th Division moved so fast during the Meuse-Argonne was simply that they knew they were invisible. When you aren't being watched, you walk taller. You take more risks. You become the giant, shaping the horizon. Historians still argue about whether the Germans ever managed to record the language for later study, but for now, in the mud of France, they are completely deaf. You look at a captured German radio, a clunky, heavy beast of tubes and wires, and you realize it's just a paperweight. I've always felt that the skyscraper and the code talker were two sides of the same coin. One was a visible monument to ambition, and the other was an invisible monument to heritage. Both were built by men who knew how to look through the danger to see the task. Personally, I find a lot of comfort in the thought that the most advanced technology on the battlefield wasn't something you could build in a factory. It was something you had to be born into. The night air is cold, smelling of damp wool and the bitter metallic scent of the air compressors. You find a spot to sit, the sound of the Choctaw signals echoing in your mind like a soft background hum. You realize that the German confusion wasn't just a military failure, it was a cultural one. They couldn't understand the Choctaw because they hadn't bothered to see the Choctaw as people. It's a lesson in humility that I find deeply relevant, even today. The boring USA might be loud and industrial, but it's the quiet, human parts that actually hold it together. As you close your eyes, you imagine the German cryptographers sitting in their dark rooms, spinning dials and scratching their heads. You're the one with the secret. You're the one in the gang. Personally, I suspect that the boring USA project is just a way for us to remember that we're all part of something much deeper than the machines we use. You relax your grip on your helmet, the rhythmic cadence of the unbreakable signals lulling you into a strange, triumphant peace. The world is finally silent, but the wires are still talking. I think the most telling part of this section is the realization that you don't need to yell to be heard. You just need to speak a language that only your brothers understand. You take a final breath of the cold air, feeling the vibration of the distant guns, and you wait. The Germans are lost in the haze, the secret is safe, and the boring USA is finally finding its voice in the dark. Sweet dreams, while the signals keep the enemy guessing. The pace of the war has shifted from a crawl to a full-on vertical sprint, and as you enter the final weeks of October 1918, you find yourself swept up in the Meuse-Argonne push, the massive, final offensive that would either break the German line or break the world. Personally, I've always found it a bit overwhelming to think about the sheer scale of this movement. Imagine a city the size of Dallas or Prague suddenly packing up its bags and trying to move through a dense, muddy forest while people are throwing heavy metal at them. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Meuse-Argonne was the largest and bloodiest operation of the American Expeditionary Forces, lasting 47 days and involving over 1 million men. You are trudging through the dense thickets of the Argonne, where the trees look like shattered, blackened fingers reaching for a sky that has forgotten what blue looks like. The air is thick with the smell of wet limestone, cordite, and the persistent, biting cold that we talked about in the skyscraper race. The kind of cold that feels like a personal insult to your survival. I think the most relatable part of the push is the feeling of being a small, exhausted cog in a machine that has forgotten how to slow down. You're moving forward because the man behind you is moving, and the man in front of you is moving, and the unbreakable signals are the only thing keeping you all from walking into a trap. A quirky tidbit of this final offensive is that the American Army actually used thousands of homing pigeons as a backup for the telephone lines. But in the chaos of the Argonne, the pigeons often got confused by the smoke and just flew in circles. Personally, I suspect those pigeons were the only sensible ones in the forest, realizing that staying in one place was a much better idea than flying into a barrage. I've always felt that the 1918 battlefield was a place where the primitive and the high-tech were constantly tripping over each other, and you're the one caught in the middle. You see a group of Choctaw soldiers moving with the advance, their Type 1917 telephones strapped to their backs like metal shells. They are the turtles of the communications world, carrying their protection and their power with them. Personally, I'd be the first person to drop that 30-pound microwave and run. But these men are the calm center of the storm. They are transmitting the coordinates for the final jump-off points. And for the first time, the sound of progress isn't a rivet gun. It's the synchronized roar of 1,000 big guns hitting their targets because the orders weren't intercepted. I find it deeply relatable how we find a rhythm even in total chaos. It's that ironworker's gait again. The heavy-set, flat-footed shuffle that keeps you moving when your brain is screaming for you to stop. There's an authentic, gritty intensity to the way the orders are being passed now. You pass a dugout where a soldier is yelling in Choctaw to be heard over the whistling shells. I find it fascinating how a language of the plains and rivers became a language of the woods and wire. It's a scholarly debate whether the push would have stalled without the linguistic speed of the telephone squad, as traditional codes took too long to encrypt during a rapid infantry advance. Personally, I love the idea that the boring USA was winning not just with more bullets, but with more efficient syllables. It's a masterclass in adaptation, turning a heritage into a tactical edge in the most high-stakes environment on Earth. You notice the ironworkers' stare on the faces of the men, the same hollow, focused look of the guys who spent their days on the 40th floor. You don't look at the forest, you look at the next 50 yards. You focus on the task, and the abyss of the war becomes just a background color. I find it relatable that even when you're building the future of the world, your immediate concern is just where to put your feet, so you don't sink into a crater. The boring USA is finally reaching its peak, and you're the one tightening the final rivets of the war. Personally, I suspect the reason we kept coming back, floor after floor and mile after mile, was the intoxicating feeling of being the one shaping the horizon. The wind inside the Argonne has a haunting musical whistle, much like the wind through a skyscraper's rivet holes. It's a sound that tells you you're higher up or further in than any human was meant to be. I think the most authentic part of the Meuse-Argonne push was the transition from fear to a kind of rhythmic numbness. You stop defying death and just start going to work. You watch the gunman of the artillery battery pull his lanyard, and the vibration travels through your boots and up your spine. It's a pulse that matches your heartbeat. You realize that the roughneck and the code talker are the same man, the one who trades the safety of the earth for the clarity of the clouds. As the afternoon sun begins its long slide toward the horizon, casting bruised purple shadows through the broken pines, you see the signal squad setting up a new line. They are pulling the future down to the present, one word at a time. Personally, I find a strange comfort in that. We often feel so insignificant in the modern world, but here, you are the giant. You are the one ensuring that the message gets through the fire. You take a final look at your hands. They are steady. The unbreakable signals are the rock-solid foundation of this final, desperate architecture of victory. I think the most telling part of this offensive is the view from the edge. You can see the German lines breaking, a sprawling mess of ambition and iron that you are literally pulling apart. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the silence that follows a successful signal. It's a moment where you realize you've cheated gravity once more. You close your eyes for a second. The tonal hum of the Choctaw signals lulling you into a strange, uneasy peace. It's a long way to Oklahoma, but the bridge is nearly finished. The boring USA is loud, proud, and completely deaf to its own exhaustion. You take a final breath of the cold, metallic air, feeling the vibration of the world-shaping work in your bones, and you wait. The Meuse-Argonne is the final test. The secret is still safe. And the boring USA is finally finding its victory in the dark. Sweet dreams while the signals clear the path to the end. The transition from the unrelenting roar of the Meuse-Argonne to a sudden, hollow silence is a sensory experience that feels less like peace and more like a physical blow. You are standing in a field outside a shattered village on November 11, 1918, and for the first time in what feels like a century, the air isn't vibrating. Personally, I've always found it a bit unsettling how we crave silence until we actually get it. And then it just feels like the world has held its breath and forgotten how to exhale. It's a mainstream historical fact that the armistice took effect at 11 a.m. And the legend goes that the transition from the loudest noise ever created by man to total stillness happened in the space of a single heartbeat. You're standing there, your ears ringing with a ghostly, high-pitched whine, that Boilermaker's ear we talked about, and you realize that the sound of progress has finally reached its destination. I think the most relatable thing about the quiet after the storm is the sheer awkwardness of it. You're geared up for a fight, your adrenaline is spiked to the ceiling, and suddenly, someone just turns off the lights. A quirky tidbit of the armistice is that many soldiers on both sides didn't know what to do with themselves, so they just stood up and stared at each other across no man's land, like confused neighbors who had both forgotten why they were arguing. Personally, I suspect that more than a few men felt a strange sense of loss, because when your entire identity is built around the gang and the signal, the end of the work feels like a personal layoff. I've always felt that the 1920s skyscraper boom was actually a way for these guys to keep that high-altitude adrenaline going once the big guns went silent. It's a scholarly debate whether the Roaring Twenties were actually just a decade-long attempt to drown out the memory of that terrifying 1100 a.m. silence. You see the Choctaw squad sitting on a pile of rubble, their Type 1917 telephones finally unplugged and resting in the mud like discarded toys. There's an authentic, heavy fatigue in their eyes, the kind of tiredness that sleep can't fix. I find it relatable how we often focus on the celebration of victory while ignoring the hangover of survival. Personally, I love the image of Solomon Louis just leaning his head against a stone wall, watching the smoke from his last cigarette curl into a sky that is finally, mercifully, just a sky again. They aren't ninjas of the skyline or code talkers right now. They're just men who want to go home to Oklahoma. They've carried the secret, they've walked the sky of fire, and now the floor is finished. I've always thought that the most telling part of the silence is the way it makes the boring USA feel small again. Down on the ground, the reality of life is returning. The need for a meal, a warm bed, and a future. Personally, I'd be feeling a bit of a existential vertigo. Realize that I was part of the most exclusive club in the world, and now the club is being disbanded. It's that ironworkers stare again, but this time it's directed at a world that doesn't have a mission for you yet. You realize that the unbreakable signals were the heartbeat of the war, and now that the war is dead, the signals are just whispers in a forest that doesn't need to listen anymore. Historians still argue whether the code talkers realized at the time that they had changed the face of warfare forever. But as you watch the officers shaking hands and checking their watches, you see the Choctaw men being pushed back into the background. Personally, I find a lot of bitterness in that transition. They were the specialists when the world was ending, but now that the world is beginning again, they're just wards of the state again. I find it relatable that even in the most monumental achievements, the people who did the hardest work are often the first to be forgotten once the gala starts. It's the boring USA project at its most ungrateful, a theme that I suspect repeats itself floor after floor, decade after decade. You trudge away from the communication post, the mud finally starting to dry into a crust on your boots. The air smells of charred wood, and, for the first time, a hint of damp pine that doesn't smell like poison gas. I've always felt that the magic of the high steel walk and the clarity of the Choctaw code were born from the same instinct, the need to find an honest rhythm in a dishonest world. Now that the rhythm is over, you feel like a ghost in your own uniform. Personally, I suspect the reason we love these stories is that we're all looking for our own unbreakable signal in the noise of our daily lives. The sun begins to set over the ruins of France, casting those bruised purple shadows we've come to know so well. But tonight, the shadows don't look hungry. They just look long. You look at your hands. They are still steady, but they are empty. I think the most authentic part of the armistice was the realization that winning just means you get to stop. You close your eyes for a second, the phantom hum of the Choctaw language still echoing in your mind, like a soft background noise that you can't quite turn off. It's a long way home, and the bridge is finally silent. The journey back across the Atlantic is a slow, rhythmic sway that feels like the world is trying to rock you into forgetting everything you saw in the Argonne. You're standing on the deck of a troop ship in early 1919, watching the gray, churning wake of the ocean and the transition from the skywalker of the trenches to a returning veteran is a heavy, confusing piece of business. Personally, I've always found it a bit jarring how society expects you to just flip a switch and go from dodging flaming rivets of steel and lead to worrying about the price of a nickel cigar. It's a mainstream historical fact that when the 36th Division returned to the United States, they were greeted with parades and ticker tape in New York. But for the Choctaw Telephone Squad, the homecoming was a much quieter, more complicated affair. As you watch the Statue of Liberty slip past in a shroud of harbor mist, you realize that the boring USA you're returning to hasn't changed its laws just because you changed the course of a war. I think the most relatable thing about this forgotten return is the feeling of being a hero in a secret world that the people back home can't even imagine. You're walking down the gangplank with 18 men who held the nervous system of an army in their hands. But to the crowds on the pier, you're just another group of tired doughboys in wrinkled wool. A quirky tidbit of the Choctaw homecoming is that while some of the men were celebrated in their local Oklahoma newspapers, the official military records of their code talker activities were largely classified or filed away in dusty basements, essentially making their contribution a ghost story for the next 70 years. Personally, I suspect that the boring USA has a very short memory for things that don't fit into the neat, comfortable boxes of national mythology. I've always felt that there is a specific kind of loneliness in carrying a medal in your pocket that you aren't allowed to explain to your neighbor. You board a train headed west, the clack-clack of the tracks replacing the rat-tat-tat of the pneumatic hammers and machine guns. As you cross the state line into Oklahoma, the air changes. It loses that metallic, smoky tang of France and takes on the scent of dry grass, red earth, and coming rain. I find it deeply relatable how a smell can suddenly make the war feel like it happened to someone else. Personally, I'd be expecting a brass band and a key to the city, but you see the Choctaw soldiers simply stepping off the train at small, dusty depots, picking up their canvas bags, and walking back toward the hills. They are returning to a life where they still aren't allowed to vote, where their children are still being sent to schools that forbid their language, and where the unbreakable signals are once again a problem for the authorities to solve. It's an authentic, bitter pill to swallow, and it makes the red dirt of home feel a little more like a cage than a kingdom. I've always thought that the most roughneck thing about these men was their humility. They didn't come home and demand a statue. They came home and went back to the farm, the quarry, or the oil fields. Personally, I suspect that after the sensory overload of the Western Front, the boring USA was exactly what their souls needed, even if the country didn't deserve their silence. It's a scholarly debate whether the Choctaw veterans' refusal to brag about their service was a cultural trait of stoicism or a strategic choice to avoid further government scrutiny of their illegal language. Regardless, you watch as Solomon Lewis or Joseph Oklahombi disappears into the quiet landscape of the Choctaw Nation, and you realize that the secret is going underground. The view from the top has been replaced by the view from the plow, and I find it relatable how the human brain can normalize the mundane just as quickly as it normalizes the extreme. You pass a general store where a group of old men are talking about the good war, and you don't say a word. You know the truth of the ping and the thud. You know the rhythm of the tribes moving in the dark. Personally, I'd find it incredibly hard to keep my mouth shut when someone starts talking about American ingenuity without mentioning the 18 guys who actually provided it. But that's the boring USA for you. It loves the building, but it often forgets the men who drove the rivets. You find yourself sitting on a porch as the sun sets over the Oklahoma plains, the sky turning that familiar, bruised purple color. The wind here doesn't whistle through steel beams or shattered trees. It just sighs through the tall grass. It's a peaceful sound, but it feels hollow. I think the most authentic part of the Forgotten Return is the realization that you've traded the clarity of the clouds for the muddle of the earth. You look at your hands. They are still steady, still capable of catching fire or holding a wire, but now they are just holding a cold cup of coffee. You realize that the unbreakable signals were the most alive you've ever been, and now you're just a ghost in a world of fences. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of this return to second-class status on the native veterans. I suspect it's why so many of them sought out the high-steel jobs in the years that followed. They needed a place where the rules of the ground didn't apply. I find it relatable that when the world tells you that you don't belong, you go to the one place where nobody can reach you: the sky. You close your eyes for a second, the phantom hum of the Choctaw signal still vibrating in your chest like a secret heartbeat. It's a long way from St. Etienne, and the bridge to the future is still being built. But for tonight, the boring USA is finally quiet. You take a deep breath of the red dust air, feeling the weight of the silence. The parades are over, the medals are in the drawer, and the signals are once again a language of the home instead of the headquarters. Personally, I find a strange comfort in that. The secret isn't lost. It's just safe. You relax into the shadows of the porch, the rhythmic sigh of the wind lulling you into a strange, respectful sleep. The war is over, the return is finished, and the boring USA is finally dreaming of a peace it hasn't quite earned. Sweet dreams, while the Oklahoma stars keep their own silent vigil. The decades that follow the Great War have a way of layering dust over the past, turning the sharp metallic memories of the Argonne into a soft, hazy folklore. You are sitting in a quiet archive in the 1970s, or perhaps just leaning against a fence in rural Oklahoma, and you realize that the legacy of silence is a tangible thing. Personally, I've always found it a bit tragic how we treat history like a lost and found bin. We only go looking for the most important pieces once we've forgotten where we put them. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Choctaw Code Talkers were not formally recognized by the U.S. government for decades. Their exploits buried under the classification of sensitive military intelligence, while the world moved on to the flashy cinematic heroics of the Second World War. You're looking at old photographs, the muted sepia and charcoal images we talked about, and you realize that the 18 men who saved the 36th Division have become ghosts in their own country. I think the most relatable part of this legacy of silence is the scholarly mystery of why they were classified for so long. Historians still argue whether the U.S. military kept the Choctaw success a secret because they planned to use the same language weapon in future conflicts, or if it was a byproduct of a bureaucracy that simply didn't know how to categorize indigenous contribution. A quirky tidbit of this era is that when the Second World War broke out, the Germans, remembering their confusion in 1918, actually sent researchers to American reservations under the guise of being tourists to try and study native languages before the shooting started. Personally, I suspect those German researchers were about as subtle as a tuxedo in a coal mine, and I find it hilarious that the boring USA was already one step ahead of them without even trying. I've always felt that the best secrets are the ones that are so simple, people assume they must be complicated. You see the names of the men in a faded ledger, names like Ben Carterby, Jeff Nelson, and Victor Brown. I find it deeply relatable how we often misplace the most vital parts of our own identity. These men went back to their lives as farmers and laborers, and many of them died before the world ever said thank you. Personally, I love the quiet dignity of that. They didn't need a plaque to know they had won. But for you, the listener, there is a nagging sense of unfinished business. It's like watching a skyscraper go up and never seeing the final spire. You realize that the boring USA project is often about the things that aren't said, the quiet, unbreakable signals that stay in the family rather than making it into the news. I've always thought that the 1920s skyscraper builders and the 1918 code talkers were the same breed of roughneck, men who did the impossible and then just walked away to find the next job. Personally, I suspect that the reason the Choctaw story remained a whisper for so long is that it challenged the boring USA narrative. It forced people to look at the fact that the most American thing on the battlefield was a language the government had tried to kill. I find it relatable how we often avoid the parts of our history that make us feel uncomfortable, preferring the shiny, simple legends instead. But as you sit in the silence of the Oklahoma hills, you realize the uncomfortable parts are where the real power lives. The atmospheric shift in the scholarly world finally began to change in the late 20th century. You see the movement for recognition, the belated medals, and the congressional acts, but it feels a bit like a too little, too late gesture. I find it relatable that we try to fix the past with a ceremony when we should have been listening to the signals all along. Personally, I'd be feeling a bit cynical about a medal given 70 years after the fact, but you suspect that for the families of the 18, it's not about the medal, it's about the name. It's about the dictionary of deception finally being read out loud. You trudge through the tall grass of a Choctaw cemetery, the red earth clinging to your shoes. The boring USA is finally waking up to the legacy of the silence, but the men themselves are long gone. I've always felt that the most authentic part of history is the stuff that stays in the dirt. You find a headstone for a veteran, and there's a small, weathered American flag stuck in the ground. It's a lonely sight, but it feels solid. You realize that the unbreakable signals never really stopped. They just changed frequency. Personally, I find a lot of comfort in the thought that some things are too big to be forgotten forever. The wind picks up, a soft musical whistle that reminds you of the argon and the high steel. It's a sound that connects the generations, a soft focus bridge between the world of 1918 and the world of tonight. I think the most important thing about the legacy of silence is that it's finally over. The signals are out, the story is being told, and the boring USA is finally learning to listen to the whispers. You close your eyes for a second, the image of the 18 specialists lulling you into a strange, respectful peace. It's a long way to Saint Etienne, but the signals have finally made it home. You take a deep breath of the cold, night air, feeling the vibration of the history in your bones. The secret is out. The legacy is being written, and the boring USA is finally finding its voice. Personally, I suspect that the most roughneck thing we can do is to keep these stories alive, one syllable at a time. You relax into the shadows, the rhythmic sigh of the Oklahoma wind lulling you into a strange, triumphant sleep. The silence is no longer a burden, it's a song. The sun is finally dipping below the horizon of the Oklahoma plains, and the red earth is turning that deep, bruised purple color that marks the end of a long day. You are standing in the heart of the Choctaw Nation, and as the heat of the day radiates back up from the ground, you realize that you've reached the end of tonight's journey. Personally, I've always found the end of a story to be a bit like the final rivet in a skyscraper. It's the moment where the structure is finally complete, and you can step back to see the whole grand, improbable thing. It's a mainstream historical fact that in 2008, the Code Talkers Recognition Act was signed into law, finally and officially honoring the 18 Choctaw pioneers alongside soldiers from other tribes who used their native languages to defend the United States. You watch the stars begin to flicker in the dark navy sky, and you realize that the unbreakable signals have finally been transcribed into the official record of the boring USA. I think the most relatable thing about this final signal is the sense of a circle being closed. It's that feeling when you finally find the missing piece of a puzzle that's been sitting under the sofa for years. A quirky tidbit of this modern recognition is that several families of the original 18 didn't even know the full extent of their grandfather's roles until the declassification of the records began to leak into the mainstream. Personally, I suspect those men preferred it that way. There's a specific kind of roughneck humility in knowing you saved a division and then just going home to feed the cows. I've always felt that the most authentic heroes are the ones who don't feel the need to shout about it, because the work itself is the reward. It's a scholarly debate whether the Choctaw Code would still be unbreakable today with modern supercomputers. But as you stand in the quiet night, you realize that technology isn't the point. The point is the human connection that no machine can simulate. You see the silhouettes of the blackjack oaks against the fading light, looking like the skeletal frames of the skyscrapers we visited earlier. I find it deeply relatable how the boring USA is actually a forest of these quiet, sturdy legacies. You've followed the wire from the mud of France to the red dust of Oklahoma, and you've seen how a language of the soul became a shield for a world in flames. Personally, I love the irony that the very thing meant to be forgotten, the Choctaw tongue, is now the very thing that makes this story unforgettable. It's a bit of cosmic justice that I find incredibly soothing as the night settles in. You realize that you aren't just a listener anymore, you're a keeper of the signal. The wind here is soft now, just a gentle, rhythmic hum through the grass that sounds like a sleepy conversation between old friends. I've always thought that the boring USA project is at its best when it lets the silence speak for itself. You look at your hands one last time. They are still, but they carry the weight of everything you've learned. Personally, I find a lot of peace in the thought that the Roughnecks and the Code Talkers were just ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the time came. It reminds us that even when we feel small and insignificant, we carry a legacy that is unbreakable. You take a final breath of the cool, nighttime air, the scent of rain and dry earth lulling you into the final stretch of our journey. As the last glow of the bruised purple sky fades into total darkness, you feel the weight of the day finally lifting. The unbreakable signals are no longer a secret of the trenches. They are a part of the air you breathe. You realize that the bridge to the future is finished, and it's built of something much stronger than steel. It's built of words, heritage, and a quiet, defiant grace. Personally, I suspect that the most boring things are actually the most beautiful, because they are the things that last. You relax your grip on the day, let the world fade into a soft focus, and prepare for a deep, well-earned rest. The Oklahoma night is vast and silent, but if you listen closely, you can still hear it. That tonal, rhythmic hum in the wind. It's the sound of the 18th, the sound of the tribes, and the sound of a country that finally found its voice. You've walked the sky and you've spoken the code, and now it's time to sleep. The boring USA is finally still, and the signals are keeping watch over your dreams. The world has become very quiet now, hasn't it? The clatter of the pneumatic hammers has faded into a distant memory, and the sharp, urgent whispers of the Choctaw wires have settled into a gentle, rhythmic lullaby. You can feel the heaviness in your limbs, that deep, comfortable warmth that comes when the journey is finally over, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The skyscrapers of New York and the forests of France are just shadows now, drifting away into the soft focus mist of the past. You are safe, tucked away from the wind and the noise, surrounded by the quiet legacy of the men who built the world and the men who saved it. The red dust of Oklahoma has settled, and the bruised purple sky has turned into a blanket of infinite silent stars. Each star is like a single rivet in the canopy of the night, holding everything together while you rest. You don't need to worry about the signals or the secret anymore. They are part of the earth now, as steady and solid as the limestone. Your breathing has slowed to match the rhythmic sigh of the tall grass, a long, slow exhale that carries away the last of the day's tension. The boring USA is at peace, and you are part of that peace. Let the imagery of the high steel and the hidden codes fade into a soft golden amber glow. There is no more work to be done, no more fire to catch, and no more wires to mend. There is only the hum of the fan, the softness of the pillow, and the long, slow drift into a dreamless sleep. The signals are quiet. The gang is at rest. Everything is exactly as it should be. Close your eyes now. The sky is holding firm.